What's up, I'm Troubleshoot. Rust has had an absolutely massive update where there's a lighting engine overhaul, nighttime got a lot darker, and of course, the entire menu system was overhauled, loading was changed up, and things like that. The changes have been absolutely massive, and of course, you'll need an up-to-date optimization guide, which this No BS guide will take you through. Before we get into it though, this video is not going to cover Windows optimization at all. Instead, you'll find useful guides linked down below to get even more performance from your system. For now, we'll be taking our game from whatever you're sitting at. Currently, I'm sitting at 42 FPS, and we'll do a much better job of improving our FPS than just setting the preset down to low, and your game should of course look way better at the end. First of all, before we change any in-game settings, head across to Steam, locate Rust, right-click, Properties, and make sure that on the General tab, Launch Options is empty. We'll get to redoing this in just a bit. If you've got some launch options you really like, copy them and save them in a notepad for now. Once you've started up your game without any launch options, we'll start off at the very top in the Screen tab of your Options menu. Here, make sure your resolution matches your display, and of course, screen mode should be set to full screen for the best input latency, things like that. It's not true exclusive full screen, as we can pull up other windows over it, and there is a launch option that can force you to go exclusive full screen, but it's a terrible idea. I'll get to that later. FPS, you can either set it all the way down to 0, which is unlimited, or crank it all the way up to the max, which should be about the same thing. VSync definitely turn off unless you're getting screen tearing, and limit FPS in menu and background. You can turn these on if you wish to generate less heat and use less battery power while your game is paused, or of course you're tabbed out. The background option can also help when you tab out and Discord or YouTube is lagging, things like that. Then moving down to the graphics tab, here is where we can get some serious performance from our system. I'll start by setting the preset down to low, which should lower most of the options here, and you should see a pretty healthy boost in performance. Now, I'm using Rivet Tuner to get this fancy overlay, but you can Shift Tab, head across to Settings at the bottom, and under the In-Game tab, scroll down and just make sure to enable the Performance Overlay, and you can change it from just FPS to show a huge amount of detail, which if I unpause and show you there, let's make it a bit bigger, there's a ton of info now being shown. Alternatively, Rust does have a built-in FPS counter. You can hit F8, which will bring up this info in the top right. It shows you your current FPS, and I'm pretty sure that's frame time, as well as RAM being used and a GC counter, but we'll get there later. For the most part, I'd recommend the Steam overlay if you're going to be looking at your FPS counter. Then, heading into graphics, here's where we can get some serious performance from our system. At the very top, render scale, basically always have this set to 1, otherwise your game will be needlessly blurry. Then shader level, we've got 3 different steps here. 1 makes everything look rather flat and Robloxy, 3 gives you a big boost in quality, and 5 gives you the next step up, with 6 basically doing nothing. Each 2 steps that I take in this counter costs me about 1 FPS, so if you're really clawing for FPS, set it down to 1, otherwise 3 should be a minimum, and if you have a better PC, setting this up to 5 should give you the best looking experience. NVIDIA DLSS and NVIDIA DLAA, if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, these options will be available to you. I would recommend expanding NVIDIA DLSS, and you should have a few more options here. Currently, I think it's a bit broken in that we only have max quality and ultra performance. This is off. Max quality should give you a small boost in performance, and ultra performance I wouldn't recommend under any circumstances. There's supposed to be a couple more options here. Quality is probably what I would choose, but either choose max quality or nothing. I'll leave it as off. DLAA does have a pretty big performance impact. Currently we're getting 85 FPS. If we enable it, the game should look a lot better, but you should also experience quite a bit of FPS being lost if your GPU bottlenecked. You'll need to play around with this option once you're done with this optimization guide. For now, I'll leave it turned off for better FPS in most circumstances. NVIDIA Reflex mode, again with an NVIDIA GPU, set this to on. If you have a super low powered CPU, set it to on plus boost. Reflex latency marker, off. Pixel light count, this used to quite drastically change how Windows showed. Previously, with this option set down to the lowest, you could see through Windows quite a bit better than a pixel light count of 8. Here's 8 versus 0, but I think this option's either broken or it's not as noticeable as before. Leave pixel light count on 0. Particle raycast budget, this is a pretty big number here. However, there's no effect on performance or looks, leave it on 4. Soft particles is a relatively interesting option if we change it to nighttime and you're looking at a fire or something like that. Turning this option on gets rid of quite a bit of that bloom. Performance-wise, there shouldn't be a difference. Personally, I like leaving this turned on just as it looks a little bit cleaner. Then moving it down here to world. First of all, draw distance. As you can see, when you're really high up, the world seems to get sliced in half really quickly. This happens if your draw distance is all the way down. So for example, here's 500, 1000, and 2500, which is the max. At the max, you'll barely notice this weird effect, and on 1500, I don't really notice it either. Performance-wise, each step is going to cost you quite a bit. For me, each 500 costs about 2 to 3 FPS when I was at 80, meaning that 1500 is probably as high as I would go here. But of course, you can lower this as you see fit, but keep in mind that this not only hides more distant monuments like oil rig there, it also affects minicopters, things like that. They won't render in as far away. 1500 seems to be a good middle ground here. Then water reflections and quality, this is super weird. If we fly over here, you can see that we've got some ocean and a river right here. Water quality only affects the ocean. Here's 0, 1, and 2. For the most part, it's these waves here. Here's 2, 1, and 0. Leave it on 0 for better performance. That being said, even if you're nowhere close to the ocean, having this option set up higher is going to cost you FPS no matter where you are. On my system, it was about 1 to 2 FPS per increase. Then water reflections, this affects every kind of water source, and this is 0, 1, and 2. For example, you can see oil rig there, 2, 1, 0. There's no performance impact here, so leave your water reflections on 2. Grass shadows. This option used to have a pretty big impact. Here's grass shadows turned off versus on. The FPS difference was basically nothing between these two, and having it on made things look quite a bit better. Grass displacement is incredibly useful. I'd recommend always having it on, as if you drop some things into the grass, you'll much more easily see them than grass displacement turned off. Even though this can cost you 1 to 2 FPS, leave it on always. Precise terrain billboards doesn't do anything, leave it off. Then down to textures here. This option has a massive impact on how the game looks. Here's 8th resolution, for example, quarter, half, and full. This does have a pretty big FPS cost, especially on lower VRAM graphics cards. This really eats away at VRAM. For the most part, if you have a really weak PC, you'll have no option but 8th, but I'd recommend trying that out, seeing your FPS, and then moving up to half. This should give you a much better looking game with very little FPS impact, and if you have a really powerful system, consider moving to full resolution, but even on those, there's a pretty big step in performance between these two here. That being said, if you've already got way more than 90 frames, setting it up to full is perfect. This is your preference though, half is more than good enough performance-wise. Anisotropic filtering and filtering level, both of these options have no real effect on performance and they should make textures look quite a bit better. Here's both of them set to off and 0. Versus all the way up to all textures and 16. I think this option's pretty broken currently, but as they come with no performance cost, I'd recommend all textures and setting it down to 8 versus 16. In the previous update, there was no real visual difference, and performance-wise neither, but 8 in all textures is more than fine. Parallax mapping. This option has no effect. Down to shadows over here, this is a bit of a tricky one. If we throw down something, you can see a shadow here. This is shadow quality set to off, and then 1, 2, and 3. Between these, I didn't really see an FPS cost, but on lower end systems there might be one. Leave this option on 1 for softer shadows. Then, shadow resolution. This option goes from low to medium, high, and very high. The only visual difference is between low and medium. However, performance-wise, there's no difference between these two, and there's no difference between high and very high. But moving from medium to high, there's a pretty big FPS cost of about 6 frames from 80 on my system, so leaving it on medium is more than fine. There's no difference from low other than better shadows. Shadow mask mode doesn't do anything. Shadow cascades, having it set to none, 2, and 4 results in much sharper shadows. For me, when I was CPU bound, as in all low settings, this took me from 100 FPS down to 99 and 98, 1 FPS cost between these. On a GPU bound system, this took me from 76 down to 71, so a step of about 2 to 3 per option that you go up. Personally, I love how 4 looks. This is what I'll be playing with. Shadow max distance percentage. This should add shadows further into the distance, but 0 versus 100, I don't notice much of a difference. 100, 0. This option is pretty heavy in terms of performance. For me, moving from 0 to 25 dropped me from 83 to 80 FPS. Then to 50, I dropped down to 77, and anything above 50, I didn't see a performance difference. For this reason, if you see a difference, set it to 25, otherwise 0. Max shadow lights, here's 0, 1, 2, 3. There's usually 1 to 2 FPS difference between these. However, if we put down a fire and set it to nighttime, This is what it looks like with the option set to 1. Then if we drop it to 0, you can see light through walls. This is a major competitive advantage. Always have max shadow lights set to 0. Then graphics quality. Inside of here, decor quality does nothing, leave it at 0. Grass quality, while you'd think affects the quality of grass, 1 versus 100, only really adds more grass further away, have it set down to 0. Terrain quality, this should make terrain more accurate, so here's 0 versus 100. There's a small difference here. For the most part, as hills are being drawn more accurately, it could be a competitive advantage, leaving this set quite a bit higher, so I'd recommend 100. There isn't a performance difference, so it should be fine. Max tree meshes on 10 versus 100. Having this option set lower should let you more easily see through forests. But a more important option is a hidden console command. Open it up and type in graphics.impostorshadows space 0. This is 1 and this is 0. It gets rid of a lot of shadows inside of forests, making them dramatically more easy. Not to mention, max tree meshes took me from 79 to 77 FPS between 0 and max. Then before we move away from the forests, tree quality between 0 and, let's see, more distant trees here. So 0 versus 200, this option lets you way more easily see through trees as they're not dropping down to their lower LOD, making them super blocky and pixelated. This is a competitive advantage by having it raised. This option between 0 and 200 took me from 79 to 77 FPS. It's definitely worth the 1 to 2 FPS cost. Raise it all the way up. Then object quality, this one's rather subtle. This mainly affects rocks and buildings, so flying around over here from 0 to 200, there'll be a subtle difference. But if you set it to 150, you'll get the majority of those subtle improvements with much less FPS impact. Between 0 and 150, I only really lost about 4 to 5 FPS from 90, but moving between 150 and 200, I dropped another 7 to 10 FPS, so pretty much never go above 150 here. For the most part, if you don't notice a difference between 150 and 0, leave it all the way down on 0. Then, LOD bias goes between 0.5 and 5, and as you can see in the distance over here, it really has to do with the distance at which higher quality objects are loaded in, much like these recyclers here. What I'd recommend is setting this based on whatever system you have. If you've got a really low-powered system, set it to 0.5. Mid-range, 2.5. Otherwise, if you have a really good PC, set it up to 5 and forget about it. Performance-wise, in my testing, I only dropped from 79 to 75 between 0.5 and 5, and when I was CPU-bound, I dropped from 92 to 89. So it's got a small performance cost for how much it improves how things look. For the most part, if you have it set to 2.5, you're not really going to notice the lower quality models pop in because you need to get pretty far away for them to actually happen. So for example, right over here, it actually changes. Then down to particle quality, this one doesn't really have a visual impact at all, leave it on 0. Moving down to image effects over here, you can make your game look way better, basically completely for free. As you can see, anti-aliasing is set to off, and if we change it to FXAA, things get really blurry. SMAA improved it slightly, but TSSAA is the best option by far, and it gets rid of most of those weird visual artifacts from jagged edges while looking around. Anything else like FXAA, these are super noticeable. Have this set to TSSAA for a slightly better looking, less aliased game, but it's a little bit blurry. In order to fix that, enable the sharpening effect, which is basically free. There's no FPS impact. This looks so much better than off over here, at least in my opinion, and FXAA, as well as SMAA, which is quite sharp, but TSSAA gets rid of all of those jagged edges, and this looks really nice. Performance-wise, there's basically no difference here. I did get 1 FPS dropped, changing this from off to anything else, but it shouldn't really matter. High quality bloom, this one, mainly has to do with different light sources. Here is on versus off. Personally, I don't notice much of a difference, and there's no FPS impact. Leave it on or off, doesn't really matter. Ambient occlusion, this one, is much more subtle, but it is still noticeable. Here is on versus off. On, off. This one did take me from 107 to just 103, so there's a relatively big FPS cost. For the most part, have it off unless you really care about it. Sharpening we covered. Vignetting, this is off versus on. It adds an incredibly subtle darkening effect to the corners of your screen. No FPS impact, leave this set to off. Depth of field, absolutely always have off, otherwise you'll need glasses. This is pretty extreme because I use FreeCam for creating Rust videos. you'll find a link to my Rust channel linked down below, but off should always be better. As you can see throughout most of this video, I've had motion blur on, and it's so much easier to look around and lock onto targets, especially in PvP with motion blur turned off. Absolutely always have it turned off. Lens dirt you don't see very often, but less distraction is more better while PvPing, so leave it set to off. Finally, God rays over here. These used to be quite noticeable, but if we try and stand in a place where we should see God rays, so like over here with this option turned on, I don't really see all that much. Versus off versus on. I think it's got something to do with the background over there where that hill is. It's doing some weird things. Nope, I just changed to off. That's something else to do with the lighting engine. Previously, God rays coming off of trees, just over hills, things like that while you're moving around were super distracting. I would usually recommend turning it off, but I don't see a difference here. Maybe it's currently bugged, but off is usually better for this too. Then overlay down here, blood overlay and hurt flash, leave these both off, should make PvPing a little bit more clear. Now moving across to the experimental tab, occlusion culling should definitely be turned on. This gets rid of objects behind other objects and should give you a small performance boost. However, if you experience stuttering or hitches while you're running around, then this might be an option worth turning off. No matter what you have this option set to, open your console and type in culling.safemode and set this to 0 for a small FPS boost. This is for debugging purposes, so make sure it's always set to false. Then contact shadows on versus off, a very subtle change if any at all. And performance-wise, this took me from 77 to 70 FPS while I was GPU limited, or 103 to 97 while CPU limited. A pretty costly effect, leave it off. Automatic processor affinity, unless you're playing around with Rust in your task manager, leave this set to on and let it handle it. GC buffer is a pretty important option. If you have this set all the way down to 64, you'll notice as you're moving around, especially in PvP, things like that, your game might hitch and stutter, and it's super annoying. This is because the game slowly loads more things into memory and eventually gets rid of them. When it clears out that garbage collection of old objects it doesn't need loaded, it causes a small freeze. When this GC buffer option is set all the way down, that happens really often. Crank it up, and it happens far less often. Having it up means that there's less stuttering, especially while you're running around PvPing. It can be super important. However, you can't just drag this option all the way up and forget about it. This should be set based on how much RAM you have in your system. For the most part, if you have 8 gigs of RAM, set this to, by clicking here and typing, 512. If you have 12 gigs of RAM, set it to 1024. As such, if you have 16, 2048, and anything above that, say 16 gigs or 20 gigs, set it to the highest of 4096 and forget about it. Then volumetric clouds is the newest option here. Here is off versus low, medium, high, and ultra. Looks-wise, I don't see a difference between these, except for obviously off, which is the old Rust clouds that we're more than used to, and anything else, which is these new Rust clouds, which, well, you'll have to let me know what you think down below. This is definitely a style change. So performance-wise, there's no difference. Set this to whatever you're most comfortable with. I enjoy the old Rust clouds, so I'll be sticking with these as long as we have them. Now we're basically done with optimizing our in-game settings. There's a bit more that we can do, but before we do that, here's a couple of settings that you should change for a competitive edge. Starting off in the gameplay tab over here, field of view should be your preference. It does technically affect performance, but have this set as you see fit. Turn head bob off and hurt punch as well. This should cause your screen to move around less, especially when you're getting hit. Makes it quite a bit easier. There's a hidden option. Open console and run client.clampscreenshake and set this to 1. You'll find this again down below, to lower the amount of screen shake when there's explosions happening. Super useful during raiding. Then, scrolling down, there's a couple of new options here, as well as a video explanation of what exactly is happening for certain options, which is quite nice to have. Bag gifting is a relatively new option. You can change who gives you bags. I have this set to anyone. I don't have problems with that. Show building blocked zones and range volumes are useful for when you're building. Show blocked zones should always be on, and show range volumes is relatively useful when you're putting up sprinklers, auto turrets, shotgun traps, etc. I play with both of these turned on, but range volumes turned on, and someone else in your team placing an auto turret makes a huge bubble around your base. If you don't like that, you can turn this off. It's only while people are actively placing things and not always. Then, show building preview always is a great thing to have. This will show you your teammates' building guidelines, especially useful if in PvP you're putting up walls, stuff like that. You can see what's going to happen next. Deployable snapping, also pretty new. Have this set to advanced for the best snapping experience. This is super useful useful while building, as holding shift allows you to easily snap between objects versus just trying to freeball it. Then scrolling down to censorship, hide signs, your preference, it does technically affect performance. Most of these options here are for streamers though, so these are what I have mine set to. Show blood, you can turn blood on or off, which is more just on being red and off being white. I've seen a lot of PvPers praise the white setting, but for me, I don't see a difference. On is fine. Scrolling down to physics, max gibs is super important, and there's also an upgrade effects option here, which is this small animation while building. Technically affects performance, but I do like having it on. Max gibs is super important. If you're raiding a base and your max gibs is maxed out, you're going to have a lot left over when you're breaking things. It's super distracting, especially if you're blowing into a base. You need to see what's going on immediately. If you set this option to anything higher than 0, such as 1, you'll still see this, but it won't be as much. Setting it down to 0, while it does remove some things, destroying other buildables sometimes does leave a couple of elements behind. What you can do is open console and use the command effects.maxgibs, one word, space -1, and this should get rid of anything that's left behind, making raiding a lot easier. It's definitely a competitive advantage. Then on the accessibility tab down here, you can limit flashing, which turns off strobe lights. Pretty useful. Block inventory screen input, make sure it's off, otherwise while you're looting, you can't jiggle around. Then down here by colors, these are pretty useful to change. The only one I would recommend changing is probably tree color and hollow site color. I've seen a lot of people praise the blue hollow site above this red one, so here's red and here's blue, as well as green, but more important than this, the tree marker color. Here's the default of red. At nighttime, this should almost completely vanish versus setting it to blue, it's a little bit visible up there. Here it is in daytime versus orange, which is by far the most visible at nighttime. For some reason, changing this tree marker color doesn't seem to have any effect unless you change the entire colorblind preset up here, where it changes these to different options. Not too sure why, but I think you need to have it set to custom. Nope, even that's not working. Choosing something where it changes that color is the only way that I can get this to change. That is currently broken, I assume, and is probably going to be fixed. Moving on from there, DPV camera tilt is your tilt whenever you're using that diver propulsion vehicle thing that pulls you around in the water. You can set this off here to help alleviate motion sickness. Then for some useful console commands, if you're running around and you drop something, you'll see that there's this white overlay around it. This can be controlled using your console with effects.showoutlines. You can set this to false or true by setting it to 0 or 1. Then how close you need to actually look to an object to interact with it is set by your client.lookatradius. By default, I'm pretty sure this is set to 1, so you can reach things without hassle, but you can change this to say 0.5, where you'll need to get quite a bit closer to things, or maybe 0.25, there you go, quite a bit closer, all the way down to 0, where you absolutely need to look perfectly at the object, otherwise it doesn't highlight. This is useful for reaching around small corners, getting through small spots to upgrade certain walls behind your tool cupboard, etc. I'd recommend setting up a bind for this. You'll find one down below, so you can easily toggle between 1 and 0 for easier pickups and more accurate building, things like that. When this option is set up higher, you'll notice that either looking through doors or around objects, you'll have text popping up. Putting down an armored door and toggling the hatch, there's quite a bit of text on our screen, which can be super annoying. While lowering the lookout radius would completely get rid of this, there's an even better option. Pause, head across to user interface, and here, scrolling down, under interaction, you can change the interaction crosshair mode from default to icon only, which just has the icon, or minimal, which is just the dot, but it doesn't explain what you're actually doing. It's just showing that you can interact with something. If anything, I'd recommend icon only, just so you still understand what you're about to do before you accidentally do it. Otherwise, leave it at default and instead change hide text while in ADS to on, so when you scope in, the text gets moved out of the way quite nicely. This is what I'll be playing with, otherwise icon only, but I would recommend turning off that last option as this could be pretty distracting. So use one of the two. Then scrolling down further in here, there's a couple of new options. I would assume death marker on compass is super useful. If you don't already have it, you'll have your marker for wherever you died last showing on the compass at the very top. Super useful to leave it turned on. And finally, two super niche things. First of all, if you're looking down on a roof and your legs are getting in the way of people, you can use the console command legs.enablelegs 0 to turn off your legs entirely, which is your preference. Personally, I don't struggle with this, so I'll leave it on 1 just so I can feel more in the game. Then if you're a seasoned Rust player, you've probably been running around and all of a sudden your screen gets covered in red text. To fix that, open your console and use the command console.erroroverlay 0 to turn it off, and you'll no longer have that red text on your screen fixing your issue. You're just not seeing it. Obviously, those errors could technically help you solve issues, but for the most part, whenever you see those errors, you don't have much control anyways. And then finally, headlerp. If you hold Alt to free look and let go, you'll look back to the center of the screen relatively slowly. What you can do is use the command client.headlerp, and you can set this number to anywhere between 0.1, where you look back really slowly, 1, and all the way up to 100, where you instantly snap back to the center of your screen. Personally, I much prefer 1 or maybe 2, but if you'd like to make this a little bit more snappy, you can use the command client.headlerp_inertia and set this to false, which means that you move at a constant speed from the moment you let go to where you're looking forwards. Otherwise, if you have it set to 1, there'll be a smooth ramp where it speeds up and slows down. It's a little bit snappier having head inertia set to 0. This is how I'll be playing. And finally, we've got launch arguments left, which should help you get a bit more performance out of your system. That being said, I've seen a lot of launch arguments being left behind from previous versions of Rust. Some of them actively hurt you, so here's a few that you should consider removing. First of all, gc.buffer. This option has had an in-game option for a very long time under accessibility. You can safely remove it as you set it in-game. Then, as mentioned earlier with the whole full screen thing, full screen is technically full screen borderless. They used to be exclusive full screen, but since a Unity update a while ago, it caused a lot of issues, stuttering, etc., so much so that FacePunch completely turned it off. You can still technically force it by using the command -window-mode exclusive, but you shouldn't, as that'll bring back those issues FacePunch got rid of by turning it off completely. Besides this, I've seen people adding headlerp and things like that into their launch arguments, which we can set in-game here. Once you've run commands here and changed options, it may not stay between restarts. To make sure it does stay between restarts, run the command global.writecfg as such, and this will save all of your current settings so that the next time you boot up Rust, all of your settings will still be here. Having them set in your launch arguments is just a way of saving them permanently while not actually saving them. It just sets them every time you launch the game, and it just really clutters up your launch arguments. Besides this, I've seen graphics.waves, which is technically here, and it disables larger ocean waves to test performance. If you set this to false, it should turn off those larger ocean waves, but personally, I don't see a difference looks-wise or performance-wise, so you can probably safely remove that. It shouldn't really matter, but you can technically use graphics.waves 0 and just save your config with global.writecfg once more for maybe a few extra frames. Personally, I doubt it. The only commands that I would recommend is right-clicking Rust, properties, and general launch options. These ones over here. High for high priority and force D3D no single thread. These are the only options that I've seen actually give me a small performance boost. Even though it is a pretty small performance boost, having these two launch arguments set does take me from 65 to 67 frames, increasing my 1 percentile low FPS and 0.2. So it should technically make your Rust slightly better. There are a ton of different commands that you can throw in here. One of them, for example, is maxmem, which you can set to, I would assume, set the maximum amount of memory Rust can use. And for the most part, you'll set this to your actual RAM minus about, 2 gigs. So if you have 8 gigs of RAM, set it to 6,000, for example. If you have 10, set it to 8,000, 12, 10,000. But for the most part, I don't really think this does anything. You can include it here if you wish. Personally, I leave mine on like 40k as I've got a ludicrous amount of RAM in my system. Now, I've seen hundreds more options that you can put in here, and as this is constantly changing, always evolving, make sure to check the pinned comment down below to see if I change my recommendations for anything else. And if you live by and die by including certain launch arguments, make sure to include them in your comment down below just to share it with the community. And of course, I'll benchmark it, see if it makes a difference, and change my pinned comment so you can see it there as well. With that, restart your game and you should see a small performance boost. Fantastic. Finally, there's a couple of binds that you can make while running around near big bases. You can use the commands gc.collect and gc.unload, which should cause a small little hitch or freeze, but it should clear the garbage collector and hopefully make your game a little bit less laggy when you're nearby giant buildings. You can bind this to a key, and I've seen some people bind both these options to, for example, G, which is plus map. You can do bind G, gc.collect, semicolon gc.unload, semicolon plus map, and when you hold G, your game will pause momentarily, but it'll clear your GC buffer, meaning that even though we've raised that option, your garbage collection shouldn't actually run while you're running around PvPing. It only runs when you press G, or more technically, runs while you're opening the map, so at least when you're actually running around in PvPing, there's less odds of it actually happening. Personally though, I don't see a difference, so I just leave it as bind G map. In my case, I don't have that freeze. And that's really that. I've run through absolutely everything you need to know to get way better performance out of your system, and of course, as you saw earlier, my FPS wasn't the best. I'm now comfortably sitting at around 90 FPS with a really quality, good-looking game. A lot of these settings have been moved up from their very lowest default, even though I'm getting the FPS of low, or even higher in some circumstances. I definitely do like what I've done with this game, and do let me know down below if you think I should change anything for the next video. This has been a completely up-to-date guide showing you absolutely everything you need to know about optimizing Rust for both looks, performance, and competitive edge, so do drop a like, let me know if you found this interesting, subscribe if you'd like to see more. Thank you all for watching, my name's been Troubleshoot, and I'll see you all next time, or on my Troubleshoot Rust channel, where I go through weekly skin drops, Twitch drops, etc., showing you all of them in game before they actually happen, or before you actually decide to spend money. I'll see you all next time. Ciao.